One way that critics dismiss the Bible is that they claim that we today don't even have the original Bible. They say it was passed on by word of mouth for centuries before being written down, and they claim that the copies, the written copies that we do have, were so completely altered and changed over the centuries that what we have today doesn't even resemble the original. So these critics say there's no point in reading or believing the Bible today. What evidence is there that we do have the original Bible? Let's look at the evidence. Those who rejected the accuracy of our Bibles were proved wrong on many points after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1946. A shepherd was throwing stones at a cave opening in the rock cliffs above him near the northern shore of the Dead Sea. When he hit his target and one of his stones found its way into the mouth of the cave, he was surprised to hear the sound of pottery breaking. Exploration revealed that the cave was the hiding place of clay pots, pots that contained ancient scrolls, some of them well over 2,000 years old. Other nearby caves were found to contain additional scrolls. It took experts years to carefully unroll and read the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but almost half of them turned out to be ancient copies of the Hebrew Scriptures, making up the Old Testament. Some of them were much older than previously existing Old Testament manuscripts. The big question on everyone's minds was, will they differ from our modern Bibles, or will they confirm that our text has not been changed? As it turned out, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that we have the same Old Testament that people were reading 2,200 years ago. How could text be copied by hand for 2,200 years and still remain the same? A key factor was the discipline of the Hebrew scribes, who followed strict rules to make sure that their copies accurately reproduced the originals. They even counted the number of words and the number of letters and kept comparing these numbers to the originals. And they checked each other's work so that one copyist's mistakes would be caught by another keen eye examining the new copies. Records left by such copyists tell us that the 5 books of Moses have 304,805 letters and 79,976 words in Hebrew. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls answered many of the objections raised by people who dismiss the Bible as false, but they still persist in their unbelief. It's important to mention that the critics of the Bible hold the scriptures to a higher standard than other literature. They don't dismiss those secular writings, even though we have far fewer manuscripts documenting their authenticity. Consider, for example, Julius Caesar's first-hand account that he wrote about the Gallic Wars, the wars in the land that's now called France, when the Roman Empire was conquering it. When I took Latin for 4 years in school, I had to do a lot of memorization, and I had to memorize the opening lines of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres, quarum unam incolent Belgae, aliam Aquitanae, tertiam ei ipsum lingua Celtae nostra Gallae appellantur. In English, that meant all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, another the Aquitanae, and the third those who in their own language are called Celts, in ours Gauls. The copy pictured here was produced in the year 1469 AD. That was around 1,500 years after Julius Caesar wrote it. The earliest copy we have was produced around 1000 AD, more than 1,000 years after Caesar wrote his original copy. But no one objects and says students shouldn't memorize it in Latin class because we might not have Caesar's original words. No one complains that it might have been changed so that we don't really have the original text. Everyone gladly accepts it as Caesar's writing, even though there's a 1,000-year gap. But they do object to the Bible, even though we have manuscript copies that were made much closer to the originals. For example, the Gospel of John was written or dictated by the Apostle John around the year 70 AD, and we have portions of it dated just 55 years later. So if we compare the 1,000-year gap for Caesar's writings with a 55-year gap for John's, common sense tells us we have a lot more reason to believe John's Gospel is an accurate copy than we do for Caesar's Gallic Wars. Why do so many people object to John when they don't object to Caesar? Well, it's because Caesar doesn't require anything of them, whereas John tells them that Jesus rose from the dead, and they don't want to believe that. John calls on us to believe his eyewitness account of what Jesus said and did, and how that affirms the whole Bible to be true. And that would require people to behave themselves and obey God, which they don't want to do. So they raise objections to the Gospel of John, but gladly accept Caesar's Gallic Wars based on much less evidence. We have only around 250 old manuscripts of Caesar's Gallic Wars, compared to tens of thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. So which is more worthy of belief? Similar comparisons could be made for other secular writings produced around New Testament times. Another Roman classic is Plutarch's Lives of Illustrious Men. It's widely read in scholarly circles, and I keep this 3-volume set on a top shelf in my office. Plutarch published it around 100 AD, or shortly thereafter, but the earliest copies surviving today are from 1,000 years later. Still, liberal intellectuals are glad to accept Plutarch as authentic, while they raise objections to the New Testament. The manuscript evidence is stronger for the Bible, but the Bible holds people accountable to God, and the liberal intellectuals don't like that, so they ignore the evidence. Another proof that we have the original New Testament is the ancient translations into other languages. The Greek language New Testament was translated into Old Syriac just a few years after the original copies were written in Greek. It was also translated into Old Latin just a few years after the Bible writers wrote their originals, and it was translated into Egyptian Coptic just a few years after the originals were written by the New Testament writers. And comparison of the surviving Greek copies with those other copies that were made long ago in ancient other languages shows that the original text was not changed. But what about the Old Testament? That's much, much older than the New Testament. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament around 3,500 years ago, around 1,500 years BC. Skeptics raise all sorts of objections. They say the Hebrew people were illiterate back then, and so Moses couldn't have written anything at all. They say the Old Testament name of God, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, translated Yahweh or Jehovah, they say that name of God was invented by the Jews hundreds of years later, so Moses couldn't possibly have written about it 3,500 years ago. But again, the evidence proves the skeptics wrong. News headlines that were made in March 2022, when the story broke that the archaeologists had identified an ancient curse tablet found on Mount Ebal in Israel, these news headlines helped prove the authenticity of the original Bible and prove these critics wrong. The location of this find was significant because Mount Ebal is associated with curses in the New Testament. God told Moses that he would bless Israel if they obeyed his laws, but that he would curse the nation if they disobeyed. And God required the Israelites that they should publicly read aloud those curses on Mount Ebal when they reached the promised land. We read about it in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 13, where certain tribes of Israel were instructed to stand on Mount Ebal to recite those curses. Deuteronomy 27:13 says, "And these tribes shall stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses." Joshua chapter 8 records that they did, in fact, do this when the Jews entered the promised land. And the tablet that the news reports tell about, this tablet has been dated between 1400 BC and 1200 BC. So it was produced around the time when Joshua led the Israelites there, around 3,400 years ago. The tablet that was discovered there on Mount Ebal is written in Old Hebrew, and it contains the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, the Hebrew name of God. So this ancient artifact that the archaeologists dug up shows that the critics are wrong when they claim that the Israelites were illiterate at that time. It shows that they're wrong when they claim that the Israelites didn't use the Tetragrammaton, the name of God in Hebrew. But what about the actual Old Testament writings themselves, aside from this curse tablet that was found? Do we have the original Bible today, accurate copies of the Old Testament? The situation, again, is very much like that of the New Testament, where skeptics accept ancient secular writings but reject the Old Testament books that have stronger evidence behind them. Secular intellectuals are happy to point to Homer and Socrates and Plato without questioning the existence of those men or the accuracy of our modern copies of their writings. But they reject Old Testament writings that have stronger supporting evidence. Homer was a Greek poet who lived and wrote around 800 BC. He's most famous for the Iliad, a history of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, which followed up after that war. The earliest fragment of Homer's Iliad is dated 400 BC, 400 years after the original writing. The oldest complete manuscript, that was just a fragment from 400 BC, the oldest complete manuscript of the Iliad dates from the 10th century AD, 1,700 years after Homer lived and wrote. Likewise, the earliest existing fragment of the Odyssey is from 1,000 years after Homer, and the oldest fairly complete manuscript of the Odyssey is from around 1000 AD, some 1,700 or 1,800 years after Homer lived. We don't find secular intellectuals rejecting the Odyssey because we might not have the original words, but they do attack the Old Testament with such accusations. We could show similar comparisons in regard to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. No one questions that they existed. No one questions their words. No one questions that we have the original teachings of those men. But the same people who object Socrates and Plato and Aristotle reject the writers of the Bible and raise doubts as to whether we have the original Bible today. What are the facts regarding the Old Testament? Well, first it should be mentioned that just as with the New Testament, we have both ancient manuscripts and ancient translations. That's significant. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, Egypt, for the use of the Greek-speaking Jewish community that was living there in Egypt. So from that point onward, we have manuscripts we can compare. We have copies of the Bible in Hebrew and in Greek to verify that no significant changes were made to either one of them. Any differences between the Hebrew copies and the Greek would stand out right away if someone made changes to the writings in either language. The Old Testament was also translated from Hebrew to Aramaic in the 1st century AD, so we have Aramaic copies to compare as well. But what about the antiquity of the original Hebrew writings themselves? Were they written as long ago as Christians and Jews believe? The oldest evidence we have of the original Old Testament consists of silver amulets that were discovered in Jerusalem, and they date somewhere back to around 650 BC to 850 BC. And inside those amulets were found, as pictured here, these tiny silver scrolls containing Hebrew language quotes from the books of Moses. These prove that Moses' writings were in existence much earlier than the skeptics have argued. Critics have tried to say that Moses was a later invention of the Jews, fabricated by later writers, but the silver amulets that have been discovered prove them wrong. Those amulets from 650 to 850 BC quote Moses' writings, showing that his writings were already in existence at the time when those amulets were made. Not only were Moses' writings quoted in those amulets, but they were also referred to by other Old Testament writers who wrote later portions of the Old Testament. And that shows that the books of Moses are much older than those other portions of the Old Testament. For example, the books of Kings and Chronicles refer to the much earlier books of Moses. We read at 2 Chronicles 34:14, while they were bringing out the money that had been taken into the temple of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord that had been given through Moses. The context shows that those earlier books of Moses had already been stored in the temple for many, many years. Jeremiah the prophet was a contemporary of those events when they found the ancient book of Moses in the temple. Jeremiah was there at the time, and Jeremiah's writings are referred to years later by the later prophet Daniel. For example, Daniel wrote, beginning at Daniel 9, verse 1, in the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent, who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So Daniel already had scriptures in his possession that contained the book of Jeremiah, and Daniel was familiar with reading Jeremiah in his scriptures at that time. And in the New Testament, Jesus quoted Daniel, further confirming the antiquity and accuracy of the surviving copies of Daniel's writings. We read at Matthew 24:15, Jesus said, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination of desolation described by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. In this way, each subsequent Bible writer confirmed the words of an earlier Bible writer from centuries earlier, and the chain of confirmation, as each one referred to older writings, goes beyond the New Testament Gospels. The rest of the New Testament quotes extensively from the Old Testament. And non-biblical books, too, written in and around the 1st century, quote and refer to the New Testament. Clement of Rome wrote around 95 AD, and Clement quotes from and refers to Matthew and Luke and Romans, Corinthians, Hebrews, 1 Timothy, and 1 Peter. This shows that all those New Testament books were already written and already circulating when Clement wrote in 95 AD, and his quotes from them confirm what the original New Testament writers said. Polycarp wrote in 110 AD and quoted from the writings of Peter and Paul. Ignatius wrote around 110 AD, and he quoted Matthew and Peter and John and Paul's letters. The Didache was written between 80 AD and 120 AD, and it contains 22 quotes from Matthew, along with references to other New Testament books. In all, there are tens of thousands of quotes from the New Testament in the writings of the early church fathers. And even the enemies of Christianity, who wrote hostile writings attacking Christianity, they quoted from the New Testament to attack it. But those quotes also help verify what the original New Testament said. In fact, there are so many other ancient writings that quote from the New Testament that even if we didn't have any New Testament manuscripts at all, we could practically piece it all together from all those quotes quoting the New Testament in other writings. But since we do have the New Testament manuscripts, as well as these thousands of other documents quoting it, these quotes just add to the proof that we do in fact have the original New Testament. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that we do have the original Bible. Are there differences among the various surviving manuscripts? Yes, of course. With thousands of years of copying, human error naturally resulted in many mistakes and changes. But with tens of thousands of manuscripts to compare, we can identify those errors and set them aside. A copying error that occurred, for example, when someone was copying the scriptures in Egypt, that copying error would not appear in the copies made in Israel or in Greece, for example. So comparison of the manuscripts helps us to recognize that an error was made in that Egyptian copy and then set it aside. So the comparison of thousands of manuscripts is pretty effective at eliminating such errors. You may find a footnote in your Bible with an alternative reading here and there, mentioning that the oldest and most reliable manuscripts say this, while some others say that. But those discrepancies are minor compared with the overall reliability of the text. They do not affect the message or the teachings of Scripture. The bottom line is that we do have the original Bible. We do have the Bible's accurate history. We do have the messages that God gave through his prophets. We do have the words that Jesus spoke and the teachings he gave us to obey. If people choose not to obey the Bible, that's their choice. But they cannot excuse their disobedience by claiming that we don't have the original Bible.